Last year, I checked my P.O. box and found that a fan had sent me this DVD, The Mysterious Islands by the Irwin Brothers. At first glance, it looks like a documentary about the Galapagos Islands, but if you look at the back of the box, you find this quote. Christians look to Jerusalem, Muslims look to Mecca, but evolutionists look to the Galapagos as the spiritual center of their scientific faith. I don't think I've ever had more first of alls after reading one single sentence. Now at this time, I had just partnered with a company called TrovaTrip to lead educational adventures around the world to teach people about wildlife and evolution and all sorts of other things. And the inaugural trip for this partnership was, you guessed it, the Galapagos Islands. I planned to take a bunch of fans there, get some wild thornberry type footage, teach some really cool biology, and then make a video about it. But this changed everything. I was no longer just a strange, white, skinny YouTuber with a few too many biology degrees off to make a travel video. I was now a strange, white, skinny YouTuber with a too few many biology degrees off to defend the honor of my Lord and Savior, Charles Darwin. So I packed up my camera and brought 50 fans from all over the world all the way to the Galapagos Islands to see if we could learn more about evolution than the Irwin Brothers. Considering the fact that this was supposed to be a travel video, but now at least half of it is going to be a reaction video, I'm not really sure how to classify this one, so just to cover all of our bases, here's the Reacteria intro. And here's the intro to my brand new world travel series. Welcome to episode 1 of Valkations. The group came up with that together while we were in the Galapagos, and it hasn't made me stop smiling since, so now you get to enjoy it too. We begin the movie by drowning and being introduced to the producers of the film.
Our journey begins today, 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador in South America, one of the farthest places from home I've ever been.
If I take one more step, it'll be the farthest away from home I've ever been.
You didn't have to travel that far to learn this stuff. I guarantee there is a state university or a nice community college which is way closer to you, and you could have learned a lot more information about evolution there than you would ever learn by sailing to Ecuador and just staring at a tortoise.
I'm John Irwin. I'm not a scientist or a historian.
Oh, well, it's a good thing that you're making a movie about science and history, then.
I'm a filmmaker. My brother and I are here to capture and document this place. And to tell the truth, I have no idea what to expect or what I'll see.
That's a bad way to run a business, John. If you're going to make a film about something, it's probably a good idea to start by at least knowing what you're planning to film.
I'm Doug Phillips, and I love this place.
That's not really a qualification. Did you bring a scientist on this trip?
I'm also excited to be able to share this adventure with my son, Joshua.
Sir, your son should be in school. Also, where is your scientist?
Almost 2 centuries ago, a man named Charles Darwin voyaged here, and the world was never the same. Darwin got some things right, but I'm convinced he got even more things wrong. And the result was a lot of confusion about science, life, man, pretty much everything. We're here to set that record straight. And our mission is simple: to test Darwin's ideas in the light of good science and eternal truth.
What a noble goal. Did you bring a scientist? Nah, I'm just teasing. They did bring a scientist on this trip, and you'll never guess who it is.
I'm Dr. John Morris, the lead scientist on this trip. My expertise is geology and rocks, and I'm particularly interested in this group of rocks, the Galapagos Islands.
They brought a geologist, and not just any geologist, they brought Dr. John Morris, who, coincidentally, was the president of the Institute for Creation Research at the time that this was filmed. Now that is what I call quality, unbiased filmmaking. If you want to make a documentary about evolution, do not bring a biologist. What you need to do is bring 3 people who don't know anything about biology, 1 person who has made a career being wrong about biology, and a literal child. That's how you get the facts. I can't get over that. You're literally starting this movie by saying that you are going to the Galapagos Islands to observe the core principle of biology in the light of good science. So you brought someone who runs a pseudoscience organization and no biologists. You could have just taken the money it took to buy a plane ticket to Ecuador and just taken and entered a bio course. Or at the very least, instead of making a documentary about the Galapagos, this could have been a documentary about making terrible financial decisions. Oh, the things we could have learned from the Irwin brothers. Get in, loser, we're going bankrupt.
This is a place filled with questions. How did the animals get here?
Lots of ways. Flying, swimming, floating, rafting. It's really no different than the way that any islands become populated.
Why do they behave differently from animals in other parts of the world?
Because of allopatric speciation and the basic principles of island biogeography. Simply put, they experience different selection pressures than similar species in other parts of the world, so they evolve different behaviors and different morphologies to match those selection pressures. Again, these are good questions, but you did not have to go to South America to ask them.
What is the real message of their unusual transformations?
There is no message. They just are, and you can choose to learn from that if you'd like to, or you can choose to listen to Dr. John Morris vomit incredulity as if it were the same thing as scientific rigor.
Modern Darwinists call these islands a laboratory for evolution. But there's another perspective. These islands are a showcase for the wisdom of the Creator.
See, this is what I'm talking about. You said that the islands are full of questions, but I'm telling you, you didn't have to go there to answer them. You did go there, and you still didn't answer them. Then, after a sequence of epic island views, we begin the hunt for the first animal featured in this film. Now, I'm going to play as much of this sequence as I can without the risk of being copyright claimed, but I'm going to cut out any mention of what animal they're looking for. You watch this sequence and try to figure out what animal you think they're hunting for here. Is it a dangerous predator? An elusive bird, perhaps? Is it a dragon? Is it the flippin' Loch Ness Monster?
Oh, it's a beauty. It's a big one. It's a huge one. Oh, take a look at this guy. Oh, he's beautiful.
It's a tortoise. They did that whole hero action sequence to find a tortoise. Maybe the juxtaposition was the joke, but considering how dramatic the rest of this movie is, I don't think that it was. It's at this point that I would like to start talking about my own trip to the Galapagos, because this movie would have you believe that these tortoises are like rare, difficult to find creatures that you really have to go out of your way to spot. But in reality, they're all over the place. In fact, we visited 2 different ranches where you can see dozens, if not hundreds, of wild tortoises, just like the one that the Irwin brothers filmed.
Finally, after all this time, we finally get to see the ducks.
You can hang out with them and learn more about them and have lunch at the restaurant, which is like 30 feet away. There's even a place where you can try on their shells. It was not some harrowing event. But to me, what was even more exciting than the wild adults out at the ranches were the babies that were being raised at the Charles Darwin Research Center on Santa Cruz Island. Here, adult tortoises, which have been rescued from life in captivity and can't be returned to the wild, help produce hundreds of offspring, which are raised in pens separated by generation and island of origin, so that they can be released in a controlled way that maximizes repopulation efforts while maintaining the unique genetics of each island's population. Watching these little dudes scramble around all day was a rare and unexpected treat that only made our time on these islands that much more special. But tortoise conservation isn't the only focus at this place. They also have programs working to conserve mangrove forests and threatened plant species, to restore arid zones, to control invasive vampire flies, to conserve marine birds and sea turtles, to study the unique ecology of the islands, and so much more. And funny enough, the Charles Darwin Research Station is located on Santa Cruz Island, which is one of the islands that Darwin himself never visited. These tortoises are such an iconic part of these islands that the islands are actually named after them. The word Galapagos is an old Spanish word meaning saddle, and it was used to describe the distinctive saddle shape that some of the tortoises have. So the word Galapagos became the name for the tortoise, and since those tortoises aren't found anywhere else, the name stuck. But not all of the tortoises have that saddle-shaped shell. That's just for the ones that have evolved to be able to reach their necks upward to munch on the higher cactus pads. The other group of tortoises have dome-shaped shells, and the difference between them is a great example of adaptive radiation, in which one ancestral species diversifies rapidly, producing several distinct species which fill different niches. A couple of centuries ago, sailors found these tortoises to be easy and portable sources of meat, especially because they can survive for months without fresh water. As is all too often the case in biology, humans caused irreparable harm to both these animals and their ecosystems. But thanks to conservation efforts here at the Darwin Research Station, things are finally looking up. What isn't looking up, however, is the expedition of our intrepid crew of displaced pseudoscientists.
This place is truly amazing. But one question stands out above all.
Why are we here? Tell me a little bit of why you invited us to be on this journey with you.
You're just now asking that?
Well, I say there's two parts to the answer. Part number one is, it is the defining issue at the defining time. But as I was approaching the year 2009 and the anniversary of Darwin, some years ago, I said, we've got to go to ground zero. We've got to go to basically the Jerusalem of the evolutionary worldview. That's Galapagos. But how that was going to come to pass, a number of things needed to come together, and the providence of God, all of them did.
I don't know why you guys complicate things so much. You don't need the providence of God to go to the Galapagos. You just need a passport and a plane ticket. Doug then reintroduces Dr. Morris in the funniest way possible.
When we came to Galapagos, we knew that we would have to handle the geology, but we also have to talk biology. We have to talk genetics. We have to talk a bunch of different issues.
So we brought somebody with no training in any of that, who also runs an organization dedicated to proclaiming that the central theory of all of those disciplines is wrong. We then get this long sequence about Darwin's life, which paints him as this tragic figure who is manipulated by his evil family and corrupt institutions into developing the theory of evolution as some way of coping with his indoctrination that the Bible was wrong. It's a genuinely weird part of the movie.
He was just a boy when he was first exposed to the writings of his famous grandfather, the religious skeptic Erasmus Darwin. Darwin was taught that the Bible had good moral principles, but that it could not be trusted on matters of science. This confusing idea of the fixity of species created a false dichotomy between scripture and science. The result was compromise. Darwin would bring these beliefs and growing concerns over the legitimacy of Christianity on board the HMS Beagle during its famous 5-year voyage. While on these islands, Darwin had many questions, but it was not until after his return to England, while cataloging his collections and polishing his journals, that he began to draw radical conclusions from his findings.
But then we get this even weirder segment where Doug starts talking about glasses.
When Darwin arrived on these islands, he was wearing glasses. We're wearing them too. In fact, everybody wears glasses. I'm not referring to reading glasses or bifocals, but the worldview lens through which we interpret facts and form our view of reality. By the time he reached the Galapagos, Darwin had been taught that the Bible had to be wrong concerning science and that the Earth was millions of years old. His interpretations and ideas were shaped by his basic assumptions.
So the whole glasses thing is just an analogy for one's worldview. It's strange and it's unnecessary, but it's not beyond comprehension. But then Doug says this.
But we've come here with a different set of glasses. We are Christians and creationists, and we presuppose the authority of the Bible, and we do so without apology. This means we believe the Bible is completely true, from cover to cover, inspired by God, and we're standing on this truth as our foundation.
You literally just admitted that you are coming into this with presuppositions. You aren't gathering evidence and analyzing data and trying to develop a new theory. You just decided what you believe, and now everything you see needs to fit into that box. That is the polar opposite of good science, which is what you claim to be coming to the Galapagos to do. I just want to make it totally clear. We are now 18 minutes into this 90-minute documentary, and the executive producer himself just told you why it isn't worth watching.
We believe that when you're wearing the right glasses, there's no contradiction between the truth of Scripture and the observations of science. And to depart from these foundations is to render science incoherent.
I'll be honest with you, this is one of those times where someone has just said something that is genuinely so wild that it's actually kind of difficult to know how to begin responding, but I'll take my best whack at it. Ignorance isn't glasses. Simply declaring that you are correct and that there's no way you can possibly be wrong and that everything you have yet to learn will confirm what you already believe is not science. It's arrogant, it's dogmatic, it's dangerous, and it's downright dumb. Oh, and speaking of dogma, we also get this persecution fantasy nonsense.
And our view is under intense opposition. In his book, The Meaning of Evolution, G. Richard Bozarth says, "The day will come when the evidence constantly accumulates around the evolutionary theory and becomes so massively persuasive that even the last and most fundamental Christian warriors will have to lay down their arms and surrender unconditionally. I believe that day will be the end of Christianity."
Since the Irwin brothers apparently aren't going to be honest with you or themselves, I'll be honest for all of us. That quote isn't from a book called The Meaning of Evolution. It's from a magazine article called The Meaning of Evolution, published in American Atheist magazine in 1978. Also, G. Richard Bozarth is not a biologist. He's a writer who has published hundreds of articles in atheist and science fiction magazines. So the Irwin brothers just tried to frame a snippet of an opinion piece from an atheist magazine from almost 50 years ago as if it were the confessed purpose of all evolutionary biology today. All that is to say, it sounds like biblical literalism isn't the only presupposition that they're starting this movie with.
Has Darwin's evolutionary thesis, birthed at Galapagos, conquered Christianity? Is the debate really over? We're here to answer these questions, for this is the place where all the controversy began, the Galapagos Islands.
19 minutes and 32 seconds in, and we just got another introduction to the premise of the movie. This sucks. Back on our adventure to learn actual science, we took a boat ride off the coast of San Cristobal, the easternmost island in the archipelago, to find a tiny island called Isla Lobos, or Wolves Island. There are no wolves in the Galapagos, that's just a local name for the sea lions. Isla Lobos is home to hundreds of frigate birds and blue-footed boobies who come here to nest. It's also covered in organic debris, like these pencil sea urchin spines, which litter the ground all around you. But it's not just birds and invertebrates on this island. As the name suggests, it's also home to lots and lots of sea lions who come here to raise their young.
Good day to you, Squire.
That also means that there are plenty of beautiful bones to be found if you look hard enough. A harsh reality of life in the wild, which provided many exciting osteology lessons for us. The boobies and the frigate birds also provided a beautiful display of the diversity of life on the islands, as they differ in so many incredible ways. The boobies display a low degree of sexual dimorphism, meaning that the males and the females look very similar. In fact, the only ways to reliably tell them apart are things like the size of their pupils, with those of the females being a little bit larger, or the sounds of their calls, with the males whistling and the females honking.
You can see which direction they're in.
So elegant.
When they mate, they nest right on the ground, producing a clutch of several eggs and taking turns tending to the nest.
He's having a hard time getting his wings straight. And there that other one goes. Just looks like a dead rubber chicken.
Incidentally, they also projectile poop in all directions around their nest, which creates this unique impact crater shape, which I found quite striking. In contrast, the frigate birds display a high degree of sexual dimorphism, with the males inflating a massive red gular sac to attract the relatively plain-looking females. They build their nests up in bushes, producing only one baby at a time, which receives all of their time and attention for up to 6 months. Even their hunting strategies are dramatically different. The boobies dive into the water to catch fish, and the frigate birds just harass other birds like the boobies, chasing them and pulling at their feathers until they get so upset that they regurgitate the fish that they just caught, and then the frigate birds just steal their puke right out from under them. How wild is that? As we walked across the island, hopping between patches of boulders along the way, we saw dozens, if not hundreds of nests, and plenty of adorable little nestlings who were just getting their start in life.
Peace be with you, baby.
But as amazing as the wildlife up on land was, it was soon time to head back to the boat and change into our wetsuits so that we could take a long snorkeling tour around the island and see what was living beneath the waves. Out there in the water, we found the source of all of those sea urchin spines, as well as a truly inordinate amount of sea cucumbers. We also found thousands of tiny anemones, beautiful stingrays, gigantic sea turtles, and countless other animals. Back to San Cristobal, a pod of dolphins tried to race our boat. The locals told us that this was quite a common occurrence, and I can say from experience, it was far from the only time that it happened. This was only the beginning of our journey, and it was truly unforgettable. Unfortunately, the creation cadets weren't having nearly as educational of an experience.
We stepped onto the red sand of Jervis Island and were greeted by one of the friendliest animals I've ever seen, Galapagos sea lions, relatives of the sea lions of California who came here from the north.
But wait, how could those sea lions be relatives of the sea lions from the north? I thought that God made these sea lions special right here because these islands are a showcase of the wisdom of the Creator. I'm only teasing. They're gonna say something silly to justify this later. We then get about 3 solid minutes of animal footage set to epic soundtracks with either no narration or meaningless narration. And don't get me wrong, I love a good music montage. I've already done a couple in this video so far, and I'm gonna do a few more. But they're supposed to be brief, and they're supposed to accent the information that's being shared. That's what makes them worth watching. In this whole movie, there are maybe like 5 science factoids, each one of which is sandwiched between 3 to 5 minutes of wordless animal footage, followed by a sermon. And then the narrator says this.
It seems most all life here depends on the ocean in some way.
And strangely enough, that one line, more than almost anything else in this entire movie, showcases just how little these people understand biology. Here's a fun fact that the Irwin brothers won't tell you. All life on Earth depends on the ocean in some way. It absorbs heat, it provides water for weather patterns, not to mention the fact that photosynthetic phytoplankton produce more oxygen than all the trees on the entire planet combined. No matter where you live in the world, over half of the oxygen you're breathing right now comes from the ocean. To be awestruck by the importance of the ocean is to begin to understand biology. But to try to make it out like these islands are so special because everything here seems to depend on the ocean, you might as well just say that you've never thought seriously about ecology or islands or the ocean before. Then we cut back to Dr. Morris, who blows it live on camera.
This is Julian Huxley, who of course was one of the great evolutionists, the grandson of Thomas Huxley. Here's what he says. It was on the Galapagos in the early autumn of 1835 that Darwin took the first steps out of the fairyland of creationism into the coherent and comprehensible world of modern biology.
He says evolution has become comprehensible. Well, you know, I would like, as a scientist, to see some evidence that it really did happen.
And then we cut back to Doug, who says this garbage.
When people think of evolution, they think of Darwin, but he was not the first to argue for evolution. However, he was the first to provide the Western world with a unified theory of origins to replace the biblical account.
Which is obviously not true and only serves to perpetuate this ethnocentric victimhood mythology in which most modern creationism is currently rooted. This idea that the Bible is the only explanation for the origin of life or complexity or whatever, or at least the only one worth mentioning, and that Darwin somehow specifically set out to target the biblical worldview. As if science hasn't historically done away with all manner of outdated thinking, including other scientific ideas, because that's literally the point of science. It's so self-important, and it's so silly. And then we immediately launch into this part about marine iguanas. In my notes about this part of the movie, I literally just wrote, "This iguana section sucks so bad." There's literally 4 minutes of B-roll interspersed with a handful of fun facts before Doug actually gets to his point. And his point, well, it certainly is a point.
But I think from a creation perspective, these are, in one sense, some of the most beautiful creatures in the world. And they're beautiful because they are one of the greatest examples I can think of the principle of mediated design.
Just so we're all clear, by mediated design, he means answers in Genesis levels of mental gymnastics in order to cope with the inescapable reality of natural selection. They can see that animals adapt to their environments, but they can't accept that they might be gaining new information, so they just say that they're only adapting in ways that God allows by selecting among traits from pre-programmed genes. It's the same thing that we've heard John and Jane say. It's the same thing that we've heard Answers in Genesis say. It's the same thing that a lot of creationists say, because it makes total sense as long as you try not to think about it too hard.
Of course, Darwin talks about natural selection, and there's a sense in which natural selection, of course, is true. Animals adapt to their environment. But the lizard is an example of not an animal mutating and gaining new information, but of the fact that when God designed these original lizard kind, he gave them the potential to adapt to all sorts of different environments. And in this particular case, these animals are singular. They swim underneath the water. They can hold their breath for long periods of time underneath the water. They're the only lizards in the entire world that can do just that, only found here in the Galapagos.
Which would necessarily imply that all other lizards have, or at least had, the genetic potential to also swim and forage underwater, just like marine iguanas. Something that we conveniently have no evidence for whatsoever.
And so we call this mediative design, that there was an original design, but then all the potential was built in for them to have these variations when they come out here. And not only that, if you look carefully, every couple of minutes you see them sneezing salt. And that's a very special gland that has adapted to this particular environment that was part of the genetic potential designed in them from the very beginning, so they can expel all the salt they get from being in the water. This is a pretty big problem for the evolutionists, because the evolutionists see several other types of reptiles that have developed salt-spitting glands. And the evolutionists say, well, each of these different types of reptiles had to uniquely develop these salt-spitting glands. But we think a better answer for this is that God designed these creatures with the potential to adapt to various environments. This particular environment, the built-in design recognized, here's what's going to work the best.
So just so we're all on the same page here, the process which produced a structure once cannot possibly produce the same structure again. However, all of the different alleles for life in so many different environments, and all of the different developmental pathways which produce so many different phenotypes across so many different lizard species around the entire world can all be contained within 2 lizards aboard Noah's Ark, each one of which contains a maximum of 2 alleles for each gene and goes through a maximum of 1 developmental pathway to produce exactly 1 phenotype. I'm sorry, I'm far too literate to accept that as an explanation. I could go on and on about just how brainless that idea is, but I've already talked about it several times on this channel, so go watch one of those videos if you want to hear what I think about that, I guess. For now, however, let's learn some actual facts about marine iguanas. Just off the coast of Isabella Island, we explored the Tintoreris islet, named after the sharks that live in the canals that cut through the landscape. These islets are relatively young, being comprised of jagged black volcanic rock, which stands starkly against the gray skies and blue seas around them. As you cast your eyes across the terrain, you see that these rocks are covered in lichen, which is a symbiotic relationship between algae and fungi. The fungus protects the algae from dehydrating, and the algae feeds the fungus with the sugars that it produces through photosynthesis. The lichen appears differentially across the lava rocks, growing at just the right angles to catch the sun at just the right times to maintain just the right temperature. This natural logic makes this landscape look even more beautiful, and somehow even more alien as well. In time, the roots of these lichens burrow into the boulders and break them down into the smaller rocks beneath our feet, which then get broken down into beautiful black sand, which in turn provides a perfect breeding ground for marine iguanas, which lay their eggs in little burrows beneath the new soil. Naturally, we saw an absolutely absurd amount of iguanas on this little islet. By the way, the name for a group of iguanas is a mess, and if you take a look at this mess of iguanas, I think you can see why. Marine iguanas are the only lizards left in the world that can swim and forage underwater, but they're still ectotherms, meaning that their internal body temperature is dependent on the environment around them. The water here is unexpectedly cold, so the iguana's dark color helps them soak up more sunlight and provides the perfect camouflage against the lava rocks.
They blend in so well.
Each one of these iguanas has their own unique look and personality, especially the ones with tags placed on them by scientists with differently colored beads that serve as identifiers. Most interestingly, just like the tortoises and the ever-famous finches on these islands, these iguanas are another great example of adaptive radiation, as there are several other land-dwelling species of iguanas that inhabit these islands, as well as several subspecies of marine iguanas alone, each one more unique than the last. It's nearly impossible to know if when the Irwin brothers released this awful movie, they anticipated that anybody who actually cares about science would ever watch it. But one thing that I know for sure that they never expected is that this video would be sponsored by Brilliant. Brilliant is an everyday learning app which puts thousands of lessons in math, science, AI, computer programming, and more right in the palm of your hand. Their lessons are handcrafted by an award-winning team of experts and designed to be uniquely effective as they allow you to learn by doing, not just by memorizing. Think about the Galapagos tortoise. They can live for over 150 years, they can go months without water, and they know absolutely nothing about calculus. That is literally the exact opposite of you as long as you download Brilliant. And right now, you can try everything that Brilliant has to offer absolutely free for a full 30 days, plus get 20% off an annual subscription to Brilliant Premium when you go to brilliant.org/ForrestValkai, click the link in the description, or scan the QR code on the screen. Do you know how search engines work? Are you versed in the ways of quantum computing? Are you able to solve a logic puzzle without crying? If not, you need to download Brilliant before the machines rise up and enslave us all. And once you do, be sure to try out their scientific thinking course. It'll show you the science behind the mundane world around you and get you hooked on learning the way a real scientist should be. So get started today by going to brilliant.org/ForrestValkai, clicking the link in the description, or scanning the QR code on the screen. Remember, you'll get full access to Brilliant Premium for free for a full 30 days, plus get 20% off your annual subscription when you use my links. Back in the Dumpumentary, Doug still isn't done with his terrible argument for mediated design. After thoroughly driving his point home about the iguanas, he's now talking about the flightless cormorant, which proves that God designed every bird to be able to swim, just in case one of them found their way to an island someday.
The best cormorant for survival here was one that worked well in the water. And apparently God built into the genetic infrastructure of this animal the ability to lose the ability to fly and to emphasize other genetic potential that's made it very successful here. God planned from the very beginning to give animals like the cormorant the ability to adapt to different environments, not by mutating into new creatures, but by emphasizing specific types of genetic potential that was already built into it.
It just bums me out so bad that anybody could be that lazy with their thinking and feel comfortable putting it on camera. Then Doug demonstrates that he doesn't know what evolution is.
Darwin concludes that small changes within a kind, something we can observe, are proof of something which has never been observed, evolution, or the transformation of one kind of animal into another.
Then the geologist demonstrates that he doesn't know what a species is.
The idea behind evolution is the origin of species and how you get new species from pre-existing species. Well, here we have an organism who's obviously related to those on the land, but yet have adopted a completely different behavior and lifestyle. But these marine iguanas were seen to be interfertile with the land-based iguanas. Evolution is all about the origin of new species. But in this case, those that we thought were different species are really the same species. It's the opposite of evolution.
They're literally not even in the same genus. And then we go back to the boat for a long string of straw men.
Natural selection is a survival of the fittest that leads to certain animals being taken out while other animals are getting stronger and better by gaining new information and transforming into brand new kinds of animals. We've never seen it. It's never been recorded. It certainly hasn't been recorded at the Galapagos. It's contrary to the biblical understanding of science and the scientific understanding of science.
Evolution, you remember, talks about these big changes. It doesn't just talk about an ape becoming a man. That's a big change, but it's not such a, it's not as big a change as a clam turning into a man, and so in evolution, a fish, has become a person.
Then Doug says this.
To the evolutionist, the idea of natural selection and evolution are largely interchangeable.
Which is something that you could only possibly say if you have never had a serious conversation with a biologist before. And finally, Doug thoroughly demonstrates that he does not even understand the science that he is arguing against. We see it first in this part about finches.
If Darwin was right, it would mean that the changes in the finches would not only be cumulative, they'd build on past generations, but they would also be directional, moving in a particular direction, sort of towards superfinch or something like that.
That is absolutely not how evolution works.
That is not what we see here. What we see is that beak sizes change. Sometimes they get bigger, sometimes they get smaller, based on the ability of the bird to adapt to different environmental weather patterns and other conditions that are here. Finches change because God has built in this genetic infrastructure that allows them to change.
And that is not how thinking works. Then, after another almost 5 minutes of watching the crew travel around the islands accompanied by more self-aggrandizing hero music, we get this statement on Darwin.
Darwin supported a form of Lamarckism, a theory of hereditability developed by French biologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. It proposed that individual traits are passed through use and disuse. Today, this theory, an essential building block for Darwin's model of evolution, has been discredited. National Geographic magazine says that modern genetics turns the spotlight on his biggest mistakes. Darwin's own ideas on the mechanism of inheritance were a mess and wrong.
Darwin didn't know about genetics because genetics hadn't been invented yet. Mendel was publishing his laws of heredity at the same time that Darwin was publishing on the origin of species. So yes, he thought that traits blended together rather than having a molecular component because he didn't know what a molecular component was. He had no idea what a nucleotide was. He thought that traits could be acquired in one's lifetime and passed on to their offspring. He didn't know a lot of stuff about a lot of stuff because he lived in the 1800s. But none of that matters because we don't worship Darwin. He was right about a lot of stuff, and he was wrong about a lot of stuff. And around 200 years of scientific research since his time have allowed us to keep the things that he was right about and throw out the things that he was wrong about. And the development of new fields of study like epigenetics have allowed us to find that even some Lamarckian ideas were more correct than we previously thought. And you know what's wild? You would actually know that if you read the article that the Irwin brothers just shamelessly quote-mined. The article is called Modern Darwins. It was published in National Geographic in 2009. And if you read the entire sentence, not just the part the Irwin brothers showed you, it says, though modern genetics vindicates Darwin in all sorts of ways, it also turns the spotlight on his biggest mistake. Darwin's own ideas about the mechanism of inheritance were a mess and wrong. It then goes on to talk about all the things that Mendel discovered that Darwin didn't know about. But that's all near the end of the article. The rest of the text is all the things that Darwin got right and how modern science has proven him right over the course of the last 2 centuries. Quote, in 1953, Francis Crick, together with a young American named James Watson, would make a discovery that has led inexorably to the triumphant vindication of almost everything Darwin deduced about evolution. Quote, DNA not only confirms the reality of evolution, it also shows at the most basic level how it reshapes living things. The Irwin brothers didn't quote any of those parts of the article because they only want to cite a big, well-known, credible source like National Geographic when it suits their purposes. When it doesn't suit their purposes, they want to vilify that same big, well-known, credible source. For example, here's how they talked about Galapagos finches.
And more than any other animal in the Galapagos, the finch has become synonymous with Darwinian natural selection. In the first edition of On the Origin of Species, Darwin briefly addresses the Galapagos finch, but in later edition, he leaves them out altogether. This may have to do with embarrassment over his poor techniques and lack of meticulous research on the Galapagos. Nonetheless, National Geographic magazine stated that in the same Galapagos finches, modern Darwinists can observe evolution in real time. This amazing claim is due to the research of Peter and Rosemary Grant.
And do you know where that quote comes from? It's from an article called Modern Darwins, published in National Geographic in 2009. The same article. In one paragraph, it's evolutionist propaganda that makes wild claims that aren't to be trusted. And in the other paragraph, it's a shameful admission about the failures of Darwin that reveal the truth about science. And at no point is it worth mentioning all the evidence for evolution detailed out throughout the rest of the article. And predictably, all of this leads to this segment on the origin of life, where the filmmakers reveal that they don't know the difference between evolution and abiogenesis.
What was the original life form? After all, Darwin's book is named On the Origin of Species. In 1871, Darwin wrote a letter to Joseph Dalton Hooker, putting forth the idea that the original spark of life could have begun in a warm little pond.
And of course, they don't actually know what abiogenesis means, so they just group in panspermia as a sub-theory within abiogenesis in order to try to make the whole theory sound silly, which just makes them sound silly.
Abiogenesis, the study of how life on our planet could have arisen from inanimate matter, has yielded many theories, including an alien race seeding life on Earth.
Perhaps the most egregious part of this, however, is the expert that they decide to quote to try to demonstrate that abiogenesis is impossible.
Professor Harold Morowitz, molecular biologist, estimated that the smallest and most simple living organism would need to have a minimum of 124 different protein molecules. He estimated that the probability for all these molecules to form by chance in one instance would be the fraction 1 divided by the number 10 to the power 8060.
For those who aren't familiar, Dr. Harold Morowitz wasn't just a molecular biologist. He was a leading expert on abiogenesis. He was such a strong advocate of the theory that he was an expert witness in the McLean versus Arkansas Board of Education case back in 1981, in which the Arkansas Board of Education was sued because they passed a statute requiring the teaching of creation science alongside evolution in public schools. And as has been the case so many times and in so many different states, the statute was found to be unconstitutional. because no matter how these anti-science zealots try to repackage their dogma as creationism or creation science or intelligent design or whatever, it's just religion, which means it has no place in a science classroom. More relevant here, however, is one notable part of that trial in which the state's attorneys asked Dr. Morowitz if he recalled an article that he had written about life's origin not being able to be predicted from physics because of the dominance of chance factors as elaborated by Jack Monod in his book, Chance and Necessity, to which Dr. Morowitz replied, yes. The article then goes on to criticize what's wrong with those points of view and why they are incorrect. They were quote mining them back then, and they're quote mining them now. These people literally have one trick, and they're sticking to it. Irwin Brothers? More like the dishonest rhetoric and didn't make a very good documentary brothers. Got 'em! We then get more epic hero music to accompany a leisurely boat cruise. All leading up to the so-called generalist geologist who apparently doesn't know what homology is either.
In the mangrove garden of the Galapagos, we see a world of diverse creatures. And one of the most interesting things we see here is that many of them have similar or homologous body parts. But why? Why do animals as different as the sea turtle and the dolphin both have flippers? When dealing with morphology in Chapter 13 of Origin of Species, Darwin argued heavily that homology, the study of comparative anatomies, was conclusive evidence of common ancestry, but it could be better understood as the handiwork of a common designer.
Those are not homologies. Those are homoplasies. Homologies are similar structures that are derived from a common ancestor with that structure. Homoplasies are structures with similar looks and functions that evolved independently without coming directly from a common ancestor. So, for example, the flippers of sea turtles and sea lions are not homologous structures, because while they do share a common ancestor from which they get traits like having 4 limbs, that's not where they got their flippers from. Their flippers came later, at different times, and from different places. Also, homology is not the study of comparative anatomies, as Dr. Morris just claimed. Those are also 2 completely different studies with completely different purposes. That being said, these are all super common mistakes that anybody could make unless they've taken an introductory undergraduate evolutionary biology course, which I don't suppose the geologist has done. Incidentally, this is why I don't talk about geology that often, because while I do consider myself to be somewhat of a generalist and could probably answer some basic questions about it, it would be completely inappropriate for me to arrogate myself as an educator about geology in, say, for example, some kind of documentary. And it would be especially ridiculous for me to say that I could debunk major theories within the field if I don't even know the basic terminology. Funny how things like humility and integrity put such limitations on a person.
While on Jarvis Island, Dr. Tom Ford, PhD in biomechanics, described to us some of these amazing biological similarities between animals and even humans.
If it was from a human hip, you'd have much more of a round bony process here. It would fit into a socket like the hip does.
I don't know anything about Dr. Tom Ford, but I do find it noteworthy that this PhD in biomechanics just forgot the word head. That bony process is the head of that bone. Now, in all fairness, I forget stupid stuff like that all the time. I'm not trying to give this guy too hard of a time here. But I think it stands out because this dude never says a single thing about either creationism or evolution. His entire talk here is just where muscles go and stuff, and the whole point is this looks different than a human bone. That's literally all he says.
But the shoulder has a process that's a little more flat. It looks like a golf ball sitting on a tee. This end looks more like an elbow would. This right here looks like, on the human arm, you have what's called the bicipital groove, and it's the long head of the bicep, comes up and through the shoulder joint. So probably the muscle belly, it looks like, may fit in there, and a tendon's gonna run through the joint.
They just put him in this documentary so that they could say there was a biologist in this documentary. And that's why he is in this documentary for, and I'm not joking here, exactly 1 minute. From the very first instant that he appears on camera to the moment that he fades away is 1 minute, almost to the frame. It would be so embarrassing for them if they had any shame at all. But Dr. Morris apparently isn't the only one who doesn't know literally anything about biology, because then Doug swoops in to dazzle us all with his ignorance.
Modern genetics has shown that many homologous animals are completely unrelated. How is it possible that humans and giant squids have both developed eyeballs with so many similarities down to the retinas?
It's possible for a lot of reasons, mainly things like deep homology, which you don't know about.
Why do completely unrelated animals living in separate environments independently evolve remarkably similar characteristics?
Because they share remarkably similar selection pressures.
The evolutionist sees these similar traits as proof of common ancestry or a common evolutionary goal, but we see them as proof of a common designer, and we believe that Jesus Christ is that exceedingly wise designer.
Back on the worst cruise in history, the leaders of the expedition are continuing to be bluntly ignorant about evolutionary theory.
Darwin made his argument from homology and morphology, essentially looking to comparative anatomical structures and the way they change. Well, this argument has been utterly blown out of the water. Today, evolutionists will tell you that whales came from a pig-type creature that existed before the whales. Why? This argument is a complete loser argument. It's a loser argument because genetics is proving to us that this is completely false.
As well as sharing their own lackluster explanations for the natural world.
What does it really prove? A common designer. It's a common designer. We have a common designer that has built in certain infrastructural design components into all of the different animals. This argument is a complete loser argument. Evolutionists will say, well, we're this percentage related, but guess what? We're almost that closely related genetically to a banana as well. This argument is a complete loser argument. John, have you seen any transitional forms lately in the fossil record?
I've been studying a lot about fossils here lately. I'm writing a book on fossils.
I think we're still waiting.
There's just no transitional forms.
This argument is a complete loser argument. So they have to accept by faith a system, even though they don't have the foundations to prove the basic assumptions. They accept their assumptions by faith. This argument is a complete loser argument.
Back on our adventure, however, we were spending time hiking up a mountain on Isabella Island. The hike consisted of miles and miles of lava rock trails, punctuated with wild tortoises,
beware of the tortoises,
poison apple trees, drastic changes in slope and elevation, and constant punishing heat.
Long, treacherous, shadeless, punishing pathways into the fucking abyss.
But all this walking got us to El Muro de las Lágrimas, the Wall of Tears. Between 1946 and 1959, this island, the harshest and most arid of all the Galapagos, was home to a penal colony established by President José Ibarra using infrastructure left by the U.S. military after World War II. Here, political prisoners and common delinquents alike were sent to languish and die in the merciless heat. One way of torturing them was to force them to carry sharp and heavy lava rocks for miles across the island, down the same path that we walked here, all to build this pointless wall. The wall stands around 20 feet high, stretches over 10 feet wide, and runs over 300 feet in length. Looking over the surface of the wall, you can see the same lichens that were consuming the lava rocks on the Tintareras Islet, just off the coast from this spot. In a few generations, this wall will be reduced to nothing but gravel, and from there will decay into a pile of sand. To me, these lichens were a sign of hope and balance. They remind me not to despair too much for the future, because no matter how cruel and how senseless we humans can be, nature, slowly but surely, will clean up our mess. From this solemn vantage point, we were able to climb up the nearby mountain, starting with these stairs which lead to the top of the wall. Then these stairs, which lead to these stairs, which lead to this path, which leads to these stairs, and then this path.
Guys, we made it to the stairs.
Which got us to the stairs, which led to the stairs, which finally led to this lookout point.
That's it. That's the top of the thing. Hell yeah.
This is Isabella Island. That is the town that I've been staying in over there. Those are the Tintoreras Islet that we just were at yesterday. That over there is Tortuga Island, and way on the other side of that is the center of the Galapagos Island, Santa Cruz, and that's where the Charles Darwin Research Center is, and the tortoise ranch we'll be going to tomorrow.
Later on, we cooled off by snorkeling around the island, taking in the natural beauty of the shallow waters and seeing all manner of incredible creatures. While we were here around Tintoreras, we swam through the canals, which were full of super chill sharks that just wanted to hang out and let the currents do their breathing for them. Even more memorable than the sharks, however, were the sea lions. Every time we hit the water, these curious creatures would rush over to swim with us, getting far closer than we expected them to, as if they were challenging us or even inviting us to play. Before we made it back to the boat, a few penguins even hopped in to catch the fish that were swimming along with us. It was an emotional and difficult and magical experience, made all the more incredible when juxtaposed against the final chapter of this atrocious movie. For this entire film, Dr. John Morris, a geologist, has been trying to debunk the central tenets of homology and genetics and evolution, demonstrating profound ignorance all along the way. And now, an hour into this movie, he is finally talking about geology. And I'll be honest, I still don't think what he's saying makes any kind of sense.
Can the Earth really be as old as the evolutionists claim?
Doug, do you see that the two different kinds of rock there toward the water, and around over here you see this is the lava that was extruded from that volcano within the last 100 years or so. The layering above that is quite interesting to me. It's very thinly bedded, and the closer you get, you still see these thin, fine little beds. That is due to an explosive eruption. the volcano was what it was. The lava flow rolled out of the crater and then came down this way. But this explosive eruption just boom, went up, and then as it came back down, it went probably out as a pyroclastic flow, it's called. And laying down one after the other, within seconds, one layer after another, these laminae. Now, you know, when I was a geology student, when I was in graduate school, I was taught that whenever you see these fine little gradations like this, that these are formed, they say, in a lake environment or maybe a lagoon, something like that. And it's seasonal deposition. And so whenever you see this layer, a winter-summer couplet, that represents a year. And if you went over here to this cliff, you'd see millions of those layers. So obviously it took millions and millions of years. No, it didn't. It probably took 4 hours or 2 hours. I mean, it just happened right now. Just boom, boom, boom. With a catastrophe, things can happen in a hurry. Things that we are taught to assign great ages to can happen in a hurry. This reminds me of Mount St. Helens. I've studied Mount St. Helens up in the state of Washington for some time, and Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980. Of course, it's erupted numerous times, but the big eruption was in 1980. And the lava dome, the solid lava dome that plugged up the vent, that rock has been dated with radioisotope dating. Now, it erupted in 1980, but you know how old that lava at Mount St. Helens dates?
No, how old?
It dates at 2.4 million years.
What's the problem? Is this a faulty dating method?
I think the method is wrong.
Now, I'm pretty sure that I could handle that argument, but the honest truth is, I just don't know enough about geology to really do it justice. But I didn't want to leave it unaddressed. So I did what the Irwin brothers would do, and I asked this theoretical physicist to clear things up.
Hey, you don't know anything about geology, do you? No. Okay, so like, what if I were to say to you that like, volcanoes lay down several layers of geological strata all at once, and that means that like, the geological strata that we see the rest of the world doesn't prove anything about deep time, because actually like, it could have just happened like in like the global flood or something like that.
Well, it sounds dumb, but are you filming this?
No.
No, I'm just kidding. I did what the Irwin brothers would never do and asked someone who actually knows what they're talking about to give me accurate information. Hey, Denali!
Hi, Forrest.
That sounds like you hate me. That's perfect.
Oh, sorry. I can do it again. It's fine. That honestly, kind of my default is to sound a bit annoyed, so that is authentic. My name is Denali. I'm a geologist and a volcanology PhD candidate. So I'm currently getting my PhD studying volcanoes in Iceland. And I have previously done some research lab work at a volcano observatory.
So what do you think about the clip that I sent you? Does anything that Dr. Morris said make any kind of sense?
So the only part that made sense was at the beginning when he first started talking, where he was saying everything he had learned. I was like, oh, this all sounds fine and normal. But then he followed that up by saying all of that stuff that I learned in my actual geology degree, that's all wrong. And then he started saying stuff that didn't make any sense. So the part that he said was wrong made sense.
So you talked about how radiometric dating is not your area of expertise, but like the second he said Mount St. Helens, my eyes rolled in my head, because like anybody who even knows like how if you have even heard about how radiometric dating works, you know why that study in particular is bullshit and why the ICR keeps citing it. So can you talk to that at all?
Yeah, so essentially he's referring to a now famous 1992 study that was done by a Dr. Stephen Austin, and that was done on a sample of the lava dome at Mount St. Helens. So most people relatively familiar with Mount St. Helens geology, volcanology have heard of this study. And he took a sample of a rock called dacite, and it formed during the 1986 magma flow for Mount St. Helens. The idea of the study is we know the actual age of the rock because we saw it erupt, right? So we witnessed it happen, and so he took that rock and sent it to be dated using radiometric dating. I love how they never actually mention the kind of radiometric dating when they're talking about this stuff. But essentially they got results that are between about 350,000 years and I think it was about 2.8 million years is that range of dates they got for this 6-year-old rock. But the part that they like to always leave out is that they used the wrong kind of radiometric dating for what they were analyzing to get an accurate result. And they likely knew that when they sent it to get dated, because that's something we already knew about this kind of radiometric dating when they did it. Basically, the technique that they used on the day site is a technique called potassium argon dating. And what that is the radioactive isotope of potassium decays into other elements over time, one of which is argon. And it happens at a rate which is a half-life of about 1.2 billion years. What that means is that if you have 100 atoms of this kind of potassium, 1.2 billion years later, you'll have 50 atoms of it. Another 1.2 billion years later, you'll have 25, and so on and so forth. And we know half-lives because scientists will observe the rate of decay in a controlled lab setting for a long period of time, and we can use that to extrapolate, okay, this is how long it would take for us to get half of the substance. And the reason that matters for the context of this paper and this controversy is that not every kind of radiometric dating is reliable for every type of substance, and specifically for every age of substance. This comes up a lot when people are talking about carbon radiometric dating, because if you use carbon radiometric dating in something that's really, really old, then that might not work very well because there might not be much carbon or that material in it to date anymore, at that point. So when you do radiometric dating and you're getting your age from how much of a substance has decayed, and it has a really long half-life, like potassium argon does, if it's been less than a decade, which 6 years is less than a decade, since that rock formed, there hasn't been enough time for the potassium to decay into enough argon to measure that accurately. It's kind of like trying to measure something the width of a hair with like a meter stick. Like, yeah, that technically is a reliable measuring tool. It's a meter stick, but it's not going to be reliable for what you're trying to measure it with. And that's why potassium argon dating isn't actually meant to be used on any sample younger than at least a few thousand years. I think for volcanic rocks, which is what this is, I've never heard it used on rocks younger than like 10 to 15,000 years. So to use it on 6,000 years and 6 years and expect that you'd get a reliable result is a little bit insane.
But Denali, you're saying that scientists in laboratories can observe a whole 1.2 or whatever billion year half-life? How can that be possible?
Yeah, so we can't because we haven't been doing the analyses for 1.2 billion years, right? Which is why when I said that, I had also said that we extrapolate, which means you take it and you observe it for a long period of time, not 1.2 billion years, but you take many measurements over a long period of time. Maybe it's years, maybe it's decades. I don't know the specific study that they did for potassium argon and how long it was, but you can measure the rate of decay during that time and use it to figure out, okay, if 1 point however many billion years had passed, how much of it would decay. And they do that calculation to the point where they figure out how long it would take for half of it to decay.
And it's also, they overlap. No one's just going to do the one kind of dating. It's like 30 different kinds of dating, and they all point to the same range. And that's why you get kind of those error bars.
Yeah, and that's another thing to keep in mind with the creation of these methods in general, is it's not like they did one potassium argon study and we're like, okay, this is the method we're going to use for everything. No, it's they've done it multiple thousands of times probably at this point in a lot of different settings with a lot of different checks and balances and consistently got the same answer. Why haven't they redone this, Austin paper and gotten that exact same answer with a more accurate dating method? Well, because that wouldn't fit their narrative. So why would they do that? They're just going to keep citing this exact same paper that people who are actually informed on the dating method haven't taken seriously for a long time.
When he talks about volcanoes laying down on a different layers all at once, and that somehow debunks the idea that other layers of strata take a long time. Like, this is a dumb question, I know, but like, seriously, are the deposition rates of volcanoes and the deposition rates through like pedogenesis even close to compare?
No, and that was one thing that he said that also drove me a little bit crazy, because of course a volcanic eruption can lay down a lot of material in a fast amount of time, but it's crazy to say that because a volcano, a pyroclastic flow, which goes down a mountain at 100 kilometers or more an hour, it's crazy to say that that can deposit things quickly. Therefore, he had mentioned lake sediment. Therefore, lake sediment could cap form quickly, that doesn't make any sense because geology is a very contextual science. It's all about context. It's why it drives me crazy when people bring me a rounded pebble from the river that I know nothing about and are like, what rock is this? And I'm like, most of the time, it's not actually that simple. Sometimes it is that simple, but most of the time you need the context. Okay, where did you find it? How long was it weathered for? Most of the time in rivers, it's too weathered for us to really say much about it, which now I'm rambling on that, so that doesn't really matter. But the important part is you need to know the context, and the context is that if it's not a volcanic deposition, if it's a lake deposition or some other depositional area, it's going to have different rules than a volcano. So no, you can't say that, oh, well, this was a pyroclastic flow and this was clearly laid down quickly, so this other thing can't have possibly taken millions of billions of years.
I love it.
Doesn't work that way. Yeah.
Speaking of lava, back on our tours of the islands, we walked through several lava tubes on both Isabela and Santa Cruz. It was incredible to see the drip patterns on the ceilings, the different layers of flows on top of flows, and the countless millipedes around the entrances to the caves. But the best part was the tiny ecosystems growing around every little speck of light. And while we were marveling about the natural history of the islands, the Irwin brothers were still talking about Darwin.
Darwin has often been presented as an open-minded Christian, an unbiased naturalist in search of answers when he came to Galapagos. But by the time he arrived here, his opinion was firmly set on two key issues. First, Darwin had rejected the biblical record of history and origins. Whilst on board the Beagle, I'd gradually come by this time to see that the Old Testament, from its manifestly false history of the world, was no more to be trusted than the sacred books of the Hindus or the beliefs of any barbarian.
Oh dear sweet Gilgamesh, somebody stop him, he's thinking for himself! Also in this part of the movie, John Morris tells everyone his story of meeting Zeus.
You know, I've been involved in the search for Noah's Ark over on Mount Ararat in Turkey. I've been there many times, and the very first expedition that I took, I was leading this expedition, 5 men of it, and we were up on the top of the mountain. Suddenly a storm came up, and we were just in this storm. We were up in the clouds. It was the most frightening thing. Before it was over, the three of us that were climbing that day were actually struck by lightning. It was like we were exploded off the mountain. We were on about a 45-degree slope and landed way down there and rolling down the mountain. And when I finally got stopped, after bashing into things all the way down, I realized that I was totally paralyzed from the waist down.
Am I the only one who reads that story entirely differently? Like, if there is a God, that doesn't sound like him sending you a sign of approval. That sounds like him issuing a restraining order. Then Doug starts talking about stars and showing random pictures of galaxies, and it's all to build up to just another terrible creationist argument that really has no place here, but they just had to shove another one in.
In 1972, astronomers Carl Sagan and George Mullen pointed out what is now known as the faint young sun paradox. According to the standard solar model, stars similar to the sun will gradually brighten over their lifetimes. Some 3.5 billion years ago, the time when life has been said to have appeared in the sea, the sun would only be around 70 to 75% of its current capacity. A staggering reality that would mean the Earth would essentially be a block of ice. A far cry from Darwin's warm little pond.
The obvious issue here being that these people know about as much about astronomy as they do about biology. The change in luminosity since the origin of life is around 25%, but that only translates to around 7% increase in temperature when you take into account the outflow of heat from the planet Earth. And none of that takes into account the complex factors that build the climate on our planet. It's not just a simple heat in, heat out system. Greenhouse gases like methane and carbon dioxide were much more abundant on the early Earth. So even if the sun were significantly cooler, we had a significantly thicker blanket to trap in more heat. And unlike anything that the Irwin brothers have presented so far, we actually have geochemical evidence for that. But of course, that sort of stuff doesn't fit into the simplified narrative of a bunch of people who admit to having no science training and one guy who has spoken within his field one time in the last 90 minutes.
This argument is a complete loser argument.
And just when you think they couldn't sink any lower, we now get to watch as Doug teaches his son how not to be a scientist by literally telling him not to think critically, but to make assumptions and presuppositions before considering any new data.
Josh, just look around you here. There's a reason why sailors call this place the world's end. It looks completely desolate. They look at rocks like this, they look at a world like this, and they think, you know, that's what I imagine the world looked like millions of years ago. But there's another story. When we look out at these rocks over here, we're looking down at the waterfront, we're starting with the right set of assumptions. And part of my mission for you as your dad is, in my heart, is that you can be a Christian who comes to a place like this and thinks like a naturalist, really thinks like a scientist for the glory of God. Just take it, study it, start from the right place, and then speak to the glory of God.
And of course, because this is a creationist movie, they simply can't help themselves but to bring up slavery and eugenics and even the Holocaust as inevitable consequences of believing in evolution.
Bear with me for a second. Let's say evolution is true. Play that out for me. What are the implications to our world, to our lives, to our families, if the Bible isn't true, evolution is?
If evolution is true, and man is simply a result of a process with no inherent worth and dignity that comes from God himself, then it means that man's life isn't valuable. And so, if we're in a struggle for survival of the fittest, people that are not perceived by the elite class to be of as much value as others, maybe they shouldn't be alive. That was Hitler's idea. That was Margaret Sanger's idea. That was the philosophy of the eugenics movement. That's the basic predicate of racism. There is no hope in evolution. Evolution is a defeatist, scientifically unsupportable philosophy which is fundamentally at war with God.
So did Darwin know what the can of worms he was opening?
Darwin absolutely knew what he was doing. As Darwin had inherited a legacy of skepticism from his grandfather Erasmus, he too would leave a multi-generational legacy through advocates who would take his ideas to their logical extreme, applying the biological thesis of Darwinism to social theory. Thomas Huxley would influence untold thousands of his day in the new faith of agnosticism. One of those converts, a student of Huxley named H.G. Wells, advanced the most radical and violent forms of race-driven population control and eugenics. Wells would invest in the life of a woman named Margaret Sanger, with whom he had an adulterous relationship, with the radical views of the eugenics movement, a movement designed to promote selective breeding as a means of improving the human species. As the founder of Planned Parenthood, this Darwinian would train millions to abort babies. These were Darwin's disciples, and they took his teaching seriously. Using Darwin's thesis, they would usher in the most violent century in recorded history.
It's as disgusting as it is predictable for these kinds of productions. I don't really want to do a whole 10-minute segment about it right now, so feel free to go watch this video, which is the most recent time that I addressed this nonsense. But suffice it to say, creationists bringing up the Holocaust is oddly as inevitable as creationists say the Holocaust is when you believe in evolution. Fortunately, things take an unintentionally funnier turn in this section on a historical debate about evolution.
In the year 1860, just 6 months after the publication of Darwin's landmark work, a famous debate took place in Oxford, England. The heated debate over Darwin's new theory of evolution raged for hours.
Sir, I would rather be descendant of a monkey than to use my gifts of oratory to spread lies!
Lies?
Lies, sir!
You're saying that the word of God is lies?
Then, to everyone's shock and surprise, an older man rose in the midst of the emotionally charged room.
And that man was Jesus!
The Bible-carrying man was none other than Admiral Robert Fitzroy.
Oh, man. Jesus would have been cooler.
The former captain of the HMS Beagle and the 5-year travel companion of Charles Darwin himself.
A man who wasn't a scientist in any capacity, but who was a devout Christian who famously disagreed with Darwin for the entire time that they knew each other, and whose bad temper and tendency to be easily offended caused his relationship to Darwin to deteriorate following the voyage of the Beagle, making this story no surprise to anyone and certainly no reason to doubt evolution. What a bombshell to end on. In the last few minutes of the movie, everybody just gets to read their own little monologue about how dumb evolution is. It's really boring.
In the evolutionary worldview, the death of animals and humans is the basis for progress, the hope that evolution will continue through the survival of the fittest. But from the Bible's perspective, death is a consequence of man's sin against God.
I want you to take this, and I just want you to remember that a good Christian soldier of the Lord is someone who goes out there and researches and investigates. So, as this trip comes to an end, as your dad, I commission you to take everything you've learned here and to live heartily for God.
The Bible is the true foundation for science. Darwin failed because he rejected that foundation.
Believe God.
Evolution is survival of the fittest. In Christianity, the most fit of all, Jesus Christ, died for the unfit.
This is a world teeming with strange and unusual life. Every rock, every plant, every creature cries out, "I am not an accident."
There's nothing wrong with being an accident. Just ask your mom. And as this terrible movie comes to a boring and preachy end, our journey in the Galapagos ended with relaxing at a beach bar, singing karaoke, touring local markets, and riding this terrifying train.
Oh, I didn't see the teeth. That's truly horrific.
It still visits me in my nightmares, and it'll visit you too, unless you click like on this video. The ride was clearly for children, and it took you all around town, which wasn't very exciting on its own, so we made sure to make every turn and speed bump into a special event. Before we left the islands, 10 people in our groups got commemorative tattoos, including one of our guides. And we got a chance to stop by this natural history museum, which looked really cool until you noticed the sign that says Seventh-day Adventist Church. I promised my travelers that I would not leave these islands until I visited that museum. And I gotta tell you, I was not disappointed. Inside, you find a short hallway full of interesting fun facts about minerals and volcanoes and animals, and if you aren't paying attention, you might not notice that the infographics contain little Bible verses every now and then. But then you turn the corner and you're greeted with totally different displays about things like how blood coagulation is irreducibly complex and how hexagons prove that there's a mathematically minded designer of the universe and how trust in God is a necessary part of a healthy life. It just goes to show that even in the Galapagos Islands themselves, you just can't get away from creationist nonsense. The end. Overall, I give this movie a Science Teacher Challenge level 1 out of 10. It taught absolutely nothing, engaged in no serious arguments, and couldn't even be bothered to frame the science that it was trying to debunk properly. And especially after having gone to the Galapagos myself and seeing just how easy it is to learn about so much stuff, there's simply no excuse for this documentary being this bad outside of deliberate dishonesty and just plain laziness. They hit all the most predictable notes, from misunderstanding basic biology concepts to claiming that Darwin was somehow directly responsible for the Holocaust. At one point, they even did the joke cliche about a tornado going through a junkyard and building an airplane.
He also calculated the formation of one E. coli bacterium in the universe at 1 in 10 to the power of 100 billion. Sir Frederick Hoyle gave the example of a tornado ripping through a junkyard and assembling a Boeing 747, something he called nonsense of a high order.
I've been hearing people make fun of that crap since middle school, and I grew up in Oklahoma. In the end, the Irwin brothers did for evolution what disco did for aeronautics, which is probably something, but certainly not what anybody wanted. They just pulled together all the worst tricks from the most notorious creationist organizations and offered them to you in the form of a subpar documentary, and the result is a cautionary tale into just how silly someone can look when they say insane things while taking themselves really, really seriously. It's a tough watch, I'll tell you. As for me, this trip to the Galapagos was one of the craziest and most fulfilling things that I've ever done. And by the time this video comes out, I will have just completed another trip in Borneo, so expect a video about that before too long too. And if you want to go on these educational adventures with me, then be sure to use the link down below to see what trips I have coming up, and to sign up for my mailing list so you can be the first to find out what I plan next. And with that, I'm Forrest Valkai. Thank you so much for watching, liking, commenting, subscribing, and all the other stuff you do here on YouTube. Please exit through the gift shop on your way out, pick up one of these sweet t-shirts. Have an awesome rest of your day. Never stop learning. Bye-bye!